Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Shannon Huffman Polson. Shannon is a leadership speaker, author, and founder of the Grit Institute. She is a U.S. Army veteran who became one of the first women to fly Apache helicopters. She is the author of The Grit Factor: Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the most male-dominated organization in the world. And I'm excited to have her on the show to talk about how to harness grit to transform your own life and career. So Shannon, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, John. It's really good to be with you.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on the show. And I'm really interested in hearing your story, your journey, and how grit helped you get through some really difficult things that you did in your life. So let's just dive right in. Tell us about your background. You know, you served in the Army, you flew Apache helicopters, which is a rare thing for women to do at the time. Tell us about that experience, and what did you learn about yourself from your time in the service?
Yeah, that's I feel like that would be a very, very long answer potentially
Yes.
to that question, but I had the honor to serve for 8 years in active duty, 2 years in the Guard, back in 1993 until 2001, and I had come out of the ROTC program at Duke University. And aviation had always been an interest of mine since I had grown up in Alaska, which is where the largest concentration of small planes and private aviation is. But then I had a chance as well to work with the National Guard for the 130th out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and was part of that aviation unit for a couple of years while I was still in college. And so the aviation world was definitely of interest. And I always had this feeling, you know, when you're 20 years old or 21 years old, that if you're going to serve your country, you may as well do it doing the hardest and the coolest thing that you can find. And aviation was definitely that. It was, I was very fortunate to grow up with a family that was very supportive and told me I could do whatever I wanted to do. It was definitely eye-opening to go into an environment where there were people who were also very supportive and were phenomenal to work with. Some of the best people I've ever known in my life. And there were others that were less excited to have Lieutenant Huffman show up when she was 23 years old as the only female out of 120 male combat pilots. So there were some very real challenges that came with that. And some of it, looking back, was part of just being a young person, young officer, a young lieutenant coming into any sort of a role. And all lieutenants go through some of those challenges of learning to get their feet on the ground. But there was definitely resistance in ways that I had not experienced before in my life. And I was, I guess, fortunate about that in some ways, and in other ways, I had to grow up really quickly.
When did you realize, now when you started ROTC, was there the option to be an Apache helicopter pilot, or when did you find out that there would be a likelihood that you could apply to that program?
Well, yeah, it wasn't actually ever in my mind. And it wasn't because I started college in 1989 and the combat exclusion clause wasn't lifted until 1993. And so right before graduation is when that clause was finally lifted and attack aviation became open to women. And honestly, it hadn't struck me as an opportunity or even as something that I was considering because it was simply not open. But when I went to get my assignment for the years ahead in North Carolina from the state aviation officer, I was still just a cadet. I was still just a college student. I remember the state aviation officer interrupting me just a few sentences in to our conversation and looking at me and saying, "You realize you will never fly an attack aircraft." And I think there was a part of me that was just, I recognized his comment at the time because at the time it wasn't open at all. But I think that probably was what made me be interested in the first place. And so that was a spark that then turned into a flame once that combat exclusion was lifted.
Wow. And so why Apaches? Was that something that really appealed to you? Was it like the alpha, like the top, tier kind of aviation role that you could get into? Is that, you're like, look, if I'm going to do it, I might as well be the best and do the most difficult.
Yes and no. I think from the aviation perspective, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I mean, you fly more if you fly in lift or support, right? Because it doesn't break as much. But I remember going through flight school actually, and one of the cadre in flight school, as we were making our selections or putting in our choices, sat me down and talked about his experience. And I remember him talking about taking off in a battalion formation and all of the crew chiefs lined up on the hangar. And of course, there's only 2 seats in the Apache, so the crew chiefs don't get to fly, which is a whole different sort of a dynamic. And so they were all lined up against the hangar watching these Apaches take off and talking about just the pride that the crew chiefs were feeling, that he was feeling as a pilot. And I think that conversation with that cadre was really what helped turn me towards Apaches. And I also had the feeling, because of course 1993 was the first desert war, right? That if you're going to be at war, you may as well be able to shoot back. And that seemed like a wise opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sure. And yeah, most lethal helicopter out there for sure. I was interesting. I had a guest on, Stephanie Treese, who was one of the first female submarine officers. So, and I had a chance to interview her, and it was interesting because what I learned through her experience, because I don't know much about helicopters, but I know a lot about submarines. And what I learned through her experience is she had to do everything I had to do, right? I mean, from nuclear power studying to submarine school to prototype, she had to do everything I had to do. And then she had to show up to a ship that had never really seen women before. And so it was like, so she had the difficulty that I went through, which was very difficult, plus the idea of going into this male-dominated world and being one of the first females on board. What was that experience for you like that? Because this was definitely a male-dominated area, right?
It was. And it was interesting too, because, I had grown up, again, I grew up in Alaska. I had a chance in college to climb Denali as part of a rotary climb, which was a phenomenal experience. I had earned my advanced, skydiving certificate. So I was used to hanging out with guys. I've always hung out with guys. That was not in and of itself an issue at all. But those are also guys that don't have an issue with you being there. And so I think that was really the challenge. And what was helpful for me many years later, and I'm answering your question kind of by coming in from writing the book, The Grit Factor, was to go back and do the research and start to put words and articulate and define what that experience was like. And there's a term that Stanford law professor Deborah Rhodes uses called the double crucible. And it's that these women, all of us that are women that have gone through these experiences, like you said, need to be on par with or better than the men that they're serving with in their technical abilities. And they need to be able to, at the same time, every day show up in an environment which may or may not support their being there. And so that was a helpful thing to be able to put some definition around, to see the research that had been done around that, because that is what it felt like. And again, this is in retrospect. I think in the midst of it, it felt like grit, right? I was like, okay, this is the term that we used growing up. This is grit. Like, you show up and you do your best and you get through it, and you make sure there's nothing anybody can say, right? Because you're going to be excellent at what you do. And then looking back, realizing what the fatigue that sets in when it's every day, you're kind of armoring yourself against certain things that probably shouldn't be part of a work environment. And I think that takes its toll, honestly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know Stephanie told me stories like she'd walk down a hallway on the boat, and some of the enlisted guys didn't know how to react to a woman on board, so they brace up against the bulkhead, and she's like, "You don't have to do that,
Right.
And she's like, I'm like, and I was thinking to myself, like, I've never had to deal with that end of it, and I'm sure there's many other stories she didn't tell me, but that kind of the idea of like, the environment wasn't ready or used to it, or they weren't fully prepared for this. It was new, right? And so everyone didn't know how to react. I mean, when I served on submarines, it was an all male crew. We didn't have any. So it's a novelty. It was new. It was like, okay, how do we deal with this now? And she was part of that early group that went on board the boats. And so, I can, through her story, I can picture the similar thing where you're showing up and like, you're the only woman in the room, and so it does add, like you said, a double crucible. It's actually twice as difficult because you're overcoming the difficult technical challenges of learning how to fly like this advanced helicopter, and then being, a groundbreaker, in terms of being one of the early females doing this. So unbelievable. When you talked about grit and your book's about grit, before we dive into the book, how do you define grit? How do you think of it?
Yeah, I have always thought of it as this dogged determination and the non-sexy stuff, right? The dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances, and that's how I've defined it. Angela Duckworth, of course, is the researcher at University of Pennsylvania. She's called it passion and perseverance towards a very long-term goal. And I think sometimes there's a very long-term goal in sight. I think over the last few years, for most of us, the horizon has been a bit more murky, and so
Yeah.
sometimes that long-term goal goes in and out of view. And sometimes a passion comes in and out as well, right? And so there is a doggedness and a determination that is just has to be part of what grit is. But I also think, and I know we're going to get to this in just a moment, that the grit is not this finite thing that we pull off the shelf for mile 23 of the marathon or for your heavy lifting days. I've seen your pictures there.
Oh
when
yeah.
you're
That's my thing.
That's good. That's good. But it's also, it's part of who we are, and it's much more part of a holistic sense of each and every person. And so I know we're going to get into the different parts of that, but I think that's an important thing because there's a lot of kind of blowback on grit right now. Like, oh my gosh, it's enough. Like we've gone through enough. We can't just deal with it anymore. We've got to change systems. And that's all true as well. But to understand it a little bit more holistically, I think is really helpful for all of us.
Okay, we're going to dive into that. So the book is called The
Great.
Grit Factor, which I love. What inspired you to put pen to paper and tell your story, but not only your story, but you introduce a lot of other women that went through similar type of, I would say, groundbreaking kind of efforts in there and had to use grit through their whole stories too. So what led you to write the book?
Yeah, a couple of things, but the primary thing was a young lieutenant reaching out. And actually it came on the heels of the integration of women into submarines, because I was asked to join this online kind of mentorship group for women integrating into submarines because I had been part of an integration as well. And it turns out none of the women in submarines wanted to talk to an Army aviator, I guess. So I never heard from them. But I did then hear from another Army aviator who was just starting her journey as well. So she was heading down to Fort Rucker to become an aviation, pilot and a leader. And she asked if I would be her mentor online. And I said, of course. And, we didn't exchange a huge number of emails, but because of her request, my initial response was, of course, I'd love to do this. And then I thought, wow, well, wait a minute. I've been out for a while. I went through business school. I've been working in the corporate world for a while. Now I wrote my first book, which is called North of Hope. And now, it's been a while since I've been in, and I was part of this early integration. So that's a lot different. And surely I need to find a way to scale the advice that I offer to this young leader, because I got out as an 03. You're much more senior than I am, and people have had a lot more experience, and people have had many different experiences depending on who they were and what the circumstances were. And so I started a project of just a blog, like I called it the Grit Project. And I started reaching out to people who would connect me with people. And then I tried to start varying the services and varying the ranks and the different experiences. And I ended up talking to general officers from across the services, a Coast Guard, one of the first combat rescue swimmers, one of the first women Army Rangers, and many, many, many more. Actually, one of the first women submariners as well. Submariners,
yes.
Well, I'm sorry.
We're funny about that. I don't know why we are, but we're very funny about that.
No, you should. I understand that that's a faux pas there, so I apologize. But 201, people, I think women don't often share their stories because we are conditioned to be more modest in some ways, and that we shouldn't talk too much about ourselves. And actually, from the military perspective, it's hard to talk about yourself. You have to get over the we and get to the sharing your story, right? And it's only when it starts to become obvious that there is value in sharing your story for other people that it became evident to me that I needed to do this work. I've always been a writer. I've always loved to write. I still love to write. It's really where I think that I'm called to kind of be in the world and show up in the world, among other places. And so I started to do this blog, and then realized after I, had several dozens of interviews, I was like, wow, this is amazing material. It's just the stories, it's the lessons learned. How can I go back and do the secondary research and try to pull all of this together and say, what do all of these experiences share in common? What can we learn from a cohort of leaders that are all vanguards in their fields? They happen to be women, they happen to be military, but this is not a book just for women or just for military, right? This is a book for leaders. And that was the intent of it from the very, very beginning. So it was just in response to a single person reaching out and asking me to mentor her.
I love
That's
it.
down
I love how
whole
just like the
program.
spark can create a flame, and that's, you know, as I've had a lot of guests on the show, a lot of authors, first time authors, and they'll say, yeah, just something will spark their, you know, they're like, you know, people want to hear this story. I need to write this story. I need to tell this story. So you know, my hat's off to you to, you know, to not ignore the spark, but actually do something with it, because I think it's really important to share these experiences for the next generation, the next group of people that are going to be going through these similar type of double crucible moments for sure. Could you maybe tell us maybe an example of maybe one or more of the people that were in your book, and maybe some aha moments from their stories that were like, oh, that's very similar to mine, but this is really unique. Anything that really stood out?
My gosh, there are so many that stand out in so many ways. There are fighter pilots and infantry officers, and of course our submariner. There we go. But yeah, I would say there are things that they share in common, and that is part of what I now call the Grit Triad. But the specific moments, yeah, there are so many of them. I guess one of them that I'd love to bring up is Erin McShane, and she was also one of the first women Army Rangers. I think she was maybe, I don't know, the 10th or something. Anyway, in that first group of incredibly tough young women, and then she also went to sapper school as well, which is
Oh,
the
wow.
advanced
Yeah.
kind of engineers training. And she felt almost more proud of her sapper experience. But she talked about going out during Ranger school and failing one of the patrols. And she was carrying the heavy weapons, and she was doing doing her best, and she failed one of the patrols. And she realized that, what it was that she needed to learn through that process. But then she said she talked to a mentor later, and I just love this, because most of us who really push ourselves hard can really deeply internalize failures, right? And overthink them, and to the point where it can be really detrimental. And she said that the mentor told her words that now I will never forget either, which is that failure is not a reflection of the person, it's a reflection of the methods that were chosen. And that in a way releases you to do the work, to do it differently and better the next time. And I thought that was really, really a helpful perspective, especially if you can imagine people in the midst of, days and days of no sleep and barely eating, and going through the woods with a heavy pack and all that goes with that. And then failing in the midst of that, and then realizing, okay, this is not about me. This is about what I did. It's about what I chose to do. So I can choose to do something differently next time. And I think that was a really helpful perspective and helpful lesson. I can give you a bunch more, but that's
no, but I like that. And I like the story of failure. We talk about that on the show a lot. It just is how, failure is such a great and powerful teaching tool that, it's visceral, it's emotional, right? You don't want that to happen again. So it's like you learn quickly, like, well, I'm sure learning how to fly a helicopter, an advanced piece of equipment like that, you make mistakes and you learn. And when you do make those mistakes, it's deep. Like, I made a lot of mistakes learning how to be an officer of the deck of this, massive submarine. And, and every time I would make a mistake and I would learn the right way to do it, it's embedded in me now. I'm never going to do that again, because I don't want that feeling again, And so failure is sometimes a great and powerful teacher, for sure.
Absolutely. And you can't let it eat away at who you are, right? You have to use that to launch yourself in the direction that then brings you forward. So I think that was a really helpful thing. Yeah. The other piece that it was really, really helpful, and I can refer to regularly, was Dawn Dunlop, who's an Air Force general. She's a test pilot. She's a test pilot in literally every single aircraft in the inventory. And we talked about, gosh, so many things, but one of the things that we really got into that ended up then introducing me to somebody else that was one of her mentors was the idea of mentorship, and the importance of not assigning like a woman to another woman necessarily, right? That mentorship has to have some sort of a chemistry. And so she ended up as a White House fellow being assigned to another woman officer, where there was just, they had nothing in common. And then she met somebody that you probably may know, Marsh Carter, who now works at MIT. He's mentored a lot of military people. And Marsh Carter and she both loved aviation. Marsh was also a pilot. And so they just sort of clicked, and he really became her mentor. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, that mentorship is important, that you need mentors that don't look like you, right? For many, many reasons. And that mentorship also is this reciprocal sort of a relationship. And so I talk about that a lot when people ask about building your team and building and finding that mentor, that it's a little bit more nuanced than I think we often give it credit for being.
Yeah, I agree. And I think chemistry is a big part of it. And, I think, I've been a mentor, I've been a mentee, and the times where you find the one that's got the right chemistry, it's that perfect moment, and I think that's that if it's forced, sometimes it doesn't work. So I think you're right. And that person may not look like you, may not have a similar path. But, just but it's so critical to have somebody there that you can bounce ideas off, especially as a leader, when a lot of times in an organization, you're it. Like I ran my first manufacturing plant at 32 years old. I was it. I was in charge of all these people, and I had no one in the building that was my peer, except one man who happened to work in strategic. He did the strategic projects, like they would do acquisitions and what have you. But he didn't work for me. He was the only person in the shop, the plant, that didn't work for me. And I asked him, I said, will you mentor me? Because I need somebody I can talk to in this building that doesn't work for me, because I'm a lone wolf here. Like I have no peers here, and that was so valuable for me as an early leader with my first manufacturing plant, having someone I could talk to that didn't work for me or wasn't in my chain of command, but could give me wisdom and to help me think through things. And it was very, very valuable.
Yes. Oh, that's a wonderful story. And it's so important, and it can be hard to find, right? But at the same time, when you're the one in charge, that's also a very lonely place to be, especially when you have to make hard decisions and things get tricky and get a little difficult. It's a very lonely place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into grit a little bit. I mean, obviously grit is an important factor in success. It was certainly important in the things that you did. We didn't talk about it, but you've a little bit, but mountaineering, like climbing, all these mountains, Denali. I mean, I've been to Alaska once, and I was one of the people that get there and never see the peak because it was covered in clouds the whole time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, most of the time it is.
But you've climbed it, and you've been through these difficult things. So, like, how do you find grit? I mean, how do ordinary people that are going up into something difficult, where do they find the grit? I mean, how did you find it? And then where do other people find it?
Yeah, I feel like I think there are many different approaches to this, and I think it's interesting because as I did my interviews for the Grit Factor, one of the questions I would ask is, can you develop this? Is this something that you just have? What do you think? And most people agree that this is something that you can both find within yourself and develop. And I believe that completely. I don't think grit is just for military pilots and big mountain climbers. It's for or I'm going to say this wrong, but submariners, right? For all of us have it. That's because we've had to find it. But I think it's something that's available to each and every single one of us. And I developed, as I went through all of these interviews, did the secondary research as well, developed something that I call the Grit Triad. And it's commit, learn, and launch, right? So it's the first part is really owning your past. And it is it's owning your story, and it's drilling down and connecting to, tethering yourself to a core purpose. So that's the first leg of it. And that doesn't mean that you are buffeted by your past. That means you do the work to say, here's the raw material of my past. Now I have both the opportunity and the responsibility to shape that raw material in the direction that I want to go. And that is what owning your story is about. It's not just about, there's no victimhood in that. There's no, it's saying, this is my story, and this is how I'm going to write my story going forward. And then there's the drilling down to core purpose. I know we're going to get more into that as well, but that's the foundation, I think, of grit and resilience. The second part of that triangle is the learn side. And that learn side is a deep engagement in the present. Every single person I interviewed talked about the team, right? So none of us do it alone, whether that is a spouse or a partner or a best friend and an intimate. It's also usually a colleague of somewhere, maybe not on the manufacturing floor necessarily, but somewhere, possibly a mentor. But there's a team that you can depend on and that you build and depend on. The second part is the art and science of active listening, which is the most critical leadership skill. Every single general officer brought this up as and this was actually the most unexpected part for me, to be honest.
Yeah.
And then finally, on that second leg is mindset. And mindset, I think about both growth mindset, somewhat broadly, as well as the stress mindset, and also this measured optimism, or this grounded optimism. And then finally, that third leg is grounded in the past. It's deeply engaged in the present, and it's looking towards the future with audacity, the willingness to take risks and to face failure. With authenticity, the willingness to show up and be who you are, and lead as who you are, which is, I will say, very difficult as somebody, a minority in a majority sort of a place. And then finally, adaptability, and being able to adapt to changing circumstances. So that's that commit, learn, and launch. It's past, present, future. And I really think of building grit as going through that triad, really starting out with that story and purpose, building that team, and then doing the work to develop that mindset. And then you can go into that launch phase.
I love that. I love, and I like how you've laid it out. You one of the things you mentioned is purpose, and I think purpose plays a big part of it. And how do you find your purpose? Say that you know, and we've talked about this on, I have a guest on the show where we talk about, you have, like, I had a purpose when I joined the military, right? But when I got out, I lost it. I came into corporate world, and for 7 years I didn't know really what I wanted to do when I grew up, because I had achieved all my goals as a 20-year-old, you know. Then what do you do for an encore, right? Very difficult. So if people are listening in and they're saying, well, I don't know my purpose, how do they even, you know, find their purpose and what they want to, you know, go after with this audacity, as you call it?
No, it is, this is, I think, maybe the most critical thing next to mindset. And together, actually, there's a purpose mindset, which is a whole nother way of thinking about them both. But I agree, many veterans especially, but actually anybody leaving any kind of a really insular environment and then moving to something else, or maybe going through a major life change with death or divorce, or being laid off. And there's a lot of people that can relate to all of these, I know. And your sense of purpose can really almost disappear. And I think that is become such an important thing that I've developed an entire course just around purpose, because especially during the pandemic, that was a place where people were away from the jobs that they knew. They were away from their routines, right? And the McKinsey studies that were done around the pandemic were really clear that the lack of connection to personal purpose, right? Not the organizational purpose, that comes second, but the lack of connection to personal purpose really results in problems with performance and with engagement and with longevity and all of those factors. And so that connection to personal purpose is both a critical thing for us to do and also for our organizations to do, of course, and hence your question. So I start Paths to Purpose with basically chapter 1 of the Grit Factor, which is owning your story. There's multiple tactical exercises around that. And then we go into purpose. And Paths to Purpose blows this out, but where I recommend people start is with what you know probably from manufacturing is called the 5 whys. And this is something that Toyota, right, of course, engineered to be able to drill down into the root cause of deficiencies. And it's asking why, not 1 time, but 5 times. And, you know, I give this example of being in the operations shop, which was my very first assignment as a lieutenant. I wanted that flight platoon. You need that flight platoon to be able to either demonstrate leadership and or learn leadership, right? Both
right.
And I was assigned to this back office staff position. And I will say I felt like it was probably unfair. It was probably because I was a woman. And so that may or may not have been the case. But you know, there was a year on staff sitting in the back corner of a windowless hangar, starting to type up operations orders or the appendices to operations orders, like at 6 o'clock at night when everybody else went home, for a year. And I wasn't doing much flying. And I had no control over the circumstance, right? And so how do you find, in the midst of a circumstance that you don't have control over, you don't have any input into really at all, how do you find that purpose? And I think about, okay, what if you ask yourself in that circumstance, the 5 whys? Why was I there? Well, I was there to fly and fight the Apache helicopter, right? Why I was trained to do so. Why I had asked for, I had earned that opportunity. Why I wanted to serve my country. That's pretty good, right? But you have to force yourself to drill down to that 5th level why or deeper. And here's the key. Here's the criteria. The why that you arrive at for your purpose needs to be agnostic of the organization and agnostic of the specific job. It has to be completely agnostic. So I wanted to serve. right? My purpose was to serve. I'd been brought up to serve and making food for the homeless through our church and delivering food on Christmas Eve with my father. And so those sorts of things teach you those values and that sense of who I was. So who I was about service. And when you can tether yourself to that purpose, you can get through any kind of turbulence that comes your way, because you keep
Yeah.
returning, making sure that you're making decisions connected to that purpose, and you'll eventually find your way into that place that you're meant to be. It's not easy. It's not
Yeah.
easy. And it
Yeah.
takes, I think, a lot of introspective work. And then it takes some faith moving forward, still tethered to that purpose, that if you remain tethered to that purpose and keep taking steps forward, you're going to ultimately end up where you need to be.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think the other thing is you're able to put up with a lot of grief along the way, a lot of
Yes.
mundane work. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I started my company 7 years ago. There's a lot of mundane things that go into entrepreneurship that nobody talks about, right? And so,
Exactly.
I have to do a lot of paperwork, and I hate paperwork. I just want, I want to go sell, I want to develop products, I want to grow. But there's a lot of mundane things. But if you're thinking about my purpose and why I'm here and what I want to get done, and
Yes.
it'll help you get through those tough times, those boring times, those like you were saying, typing up orders at 6 p.m. when you really don't want to be there. If you keep focused on what your purpose is, then I think it makes it easier to get through some of the drudgery of what you're facing.
Absolutely. No, and it's critically important. And this idea of there's a guy named Aaron Hurst, and I quote his book, The Purpose Economy, in the Grit Factor. And he's continuing to do work around purpose, and right now bringing this concept of the purpose mindset into schools, which I am also now including in the courses that I run through the Grit Institute. And the purpose mindset, I think the other idea of purpose is it gets you out of yourself. Like, I think we can make ourselves crazy with the navel gazing sometimes, right? And there's a little
Yeah.
too much put on this who we are. I mean, who you are is important, but like at the end of the day, your identity is not the end. Your identity serves a greater purpose, or we are going to continue to be in this mental health crisis, right? And I think
Yeah.
part of this needs to be connecting to something bigger than ourselves. So
Yes.
that purpose work is just critically important, and it is also what the world needs from all of us.
Absolutely. That was so important, so important. Well, I mean, is our listeners are listening in and they're getting excited about this stuff. How would they, where would you recommend what they do to get started to thinking about, I like the Grit Triad, thinking about purpose, thinking about their story. How do you recommend they get started?
Yeah, well, you can, as just an easy start, you can go on to thegritinstitute.com/manifesto and download your free Grit manifesto. That's sort of a fun way to get started. And of course, the Grit Factor will bring you deeper into all of this, which is available anywhere that books are sold. And so I'm online at shannonpolson.com as well, and a little bit on Instagram and a lot more on LinkedIn. So I'd love to see any of those places.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I think this has been a powerful conversation. I think, leaders, as you're listening into this and you're thinking, wow, do I really have a purpose? Am I suffering through the drudgery of my job? Do I not like what I'm doing right now? Do I have a purpose? Do I have a North Star that's driving me and helping me, guide me? If you don't have that, or you're struggling, these are great resources. We're going to put links in the show notes for all of Shannon's resources. And I highly recommend you pick up this book. I highly recommend you go to her website. A lot of great resources on that website. I've been through it. Fantastic. And it'll really help you get your focus, learn what grit is, and learn how to develop your own personal grit to be able to achieve all the goals that you want in your career and in your life. So, Shannon, I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about this. It's such an important topic.
Well, it's a real pleasure, John. I'm a longtime fan of yours, so I really appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, again, thanks again. Well,
Absolutely.
that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.